Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's your boy Timalik here, bringing you some chess analysis. This is the first time I'm doing this, so be sure to let me know if you like it. Today, I'm bringing you this video to talk about the King's Indian defense, and more specifically, to talk to you about threatening pieces and chess strategy. So, let's look at this game. My opponent started d4, and I decided right away that I was going to play a system like the King's Indian defense. Because I'm a newer player, and I don't have a whole lot of experience under my belt, I only play 3 systems as black. I play the Sicilian against d4, I play the King's Indian defense against d4, and anything else I go for center control and look for some tactical trades. So, whenever I see this, I know immediately that I'm going to be playing a system like the King's Indian defense. It will not be the perfect variety of the King's Indian defense. If you look in a book at exactly what the lines are supposed to be, this game isn't going to follow those. Specifically because I don't know too much of what I'm doing, and my opponent doesn't know too much either. If you look at the ratings here, I'm rated 1328 right now. My opponent was rated 1262. Neither one of us are doing so hot. So we are following the tactics the best way that we know how. So don't look at this and go, well, that's not the King's Indian defense. I know it's not quite. It's the same idea. It's the same system of play. It's not quite the textbook moves. So I played knight to f6. If you don't know about the King's Indian defense, the idea is to eventually be able to play g7, bishop g6, g6, bishop g7, castle, and then something to the effect of maybe playing d6 here, followed by knight to d7. So that way you kind of connect your knights together, everything like that. You get a good harmonious position and a safe king. We see our opponent play knight c3. The reason behind this move is our opponent would love to play e4 right now. Love to get control over the center of the board. It'd be fantastic for him. He'd have some really nicely developed pieces, and then if he plays e4, he can look into playing e5, disrupts my whole plan, right? Throws a big wrench in the works. So that's what he wants to do. That's the reasoning behind that move, and it develops a piece. What's better than that? So I play g6 here. Again, just going along with my plan. I want my bishop on g7. I want a safe king. I want to get my pieces developed really, really quickly, and I want to checkmate his king, right? First, got to make sure that mine's safe. Then I can worry about his. He plays e4 here. Again, I can't attack it with my knight, because his knight defends, and obviously a knight's worth more than a pawn. This starts to become a little bit worrisome because of the move e5, and over the next couple of moves, you're maybe going to see me start to play around e5, especially this next move. So I know I've said we want our bishop on g7, we want a castle, we want to get our knights connected, but first, I've got that e5 move to worry about, so I play d6. More of a deterrent than a solution. Right, because if we look at this, if we look at him playing e5 right now, if I take here and he takes here, I can take his queen, right off the board, and hope that he recaptures with his knight. Either way, it works for me, right? So e5, pawn takes, queen takes queen. If he takes with the king, he can't castle anymore. Then I just put my knight right here on d7, and I'm fine with that, right? I'm fine with him having his pawn here because it's about to drop. If he captures with the knight, on the other hand, then I can put my knight right here, and it looks nice. You know, it's right in the center of the board, it gives me some center control, and we start to play around that. My opponent knew that that was a risk, so decided to play a little bit more passive. However, anytime you play more passive against an opponent that is ultimately trying to checkmate your king, you're going to get rid of the initiative, and that's going to be really, really bad for you. So, my opponent plays h3. And I think the idea behind this is that he wants to put his knight right here on c3. After he puts his knight on c3, there's not going to be anything to stop me from popping into this g4 square. Or, the g4 square. There's not going to be anything to stop my knight from hopping into the g4 square if he attacks with his pawn. So he needs to play that move to limit my knight from dropping into there after he puts his knight on c3. I know that that sounds really, really confusing, and it is to a certain extent, but that's what we're getting. So I decided to continue with my plan, bishop here. I'm not really caring too much if my knight can pop into there. Can pop into d7. That's all I'm worried about. I want safe king, developed pieces. So My opponent develops his knight. Personally, I think with this move, he should have probably played e5. He's already done a great job at containing my knight, forces my knight back here, stops me from doing everything I want to do. Maybe he can attack this pawn and start to really cause some damage. It'd be very, very good for him. However, my opponent has developed perfectly here, right? It's created a really harmonious position for white. Both of his pawns are defended by the knights on either side. He's got a lot of options to play. But in chess, you always want to play against your opponent. Don't worry about what the textbooks have to say or what you see these grandmasters playing line-wise, right? You might look and say, oh, well, the Scotch game is one of the best ways to play for white. Depends on who you're playing against, doesn't it? Right? Because if your opponent varies by one move and you don't know how to take advantage of that, then all of those textbook lines aren't going to do you any good. And that's why it can maybe be more difficult to play against people that don't know what they're doing. Because as chess players, we're so used to following the lines until somebody makes a mistake, and then we take some time, figure out how to exploit that, and ultimately try to win the game. That can't always work. You can't always assume that your opponent is going to play a variation that you know, and that you can develop your pieces in the same way. You have got to take advantage of weaknesses, and right now my structure is a little bit weak. He should have taken advantage of it, but instead he chose to develop, which I'm not putting him down for it. I'm just saying that there are other ways to play, and if you're trying to win the game, you've got to look at every option. So I castled. Now that I have my safe king, I can connect my knights and start attacking. And again, that's all I want. I want to attack the center of the board, and I don't want to get checkmated. So he develops the bishop out. It was now that I started to realize that my opponent is just going for the textbook development, right? He wants to put his bishop on this square, have two bishops right next to each other, have the knights so they're defending the pawns, have the pawns so they're defending the bishop. Everything will be very harmonious and kind of synchronized for white. So I decided that I would continue with my development as well, because I know that in this position, I might have a lot of play if I can get my pieces where I want them. He castles, just fine for him, but I decided to play c5. Reason for that is, e5 has been a threat from the beginning of the game, right? He would threaten my knight, and maybe he could chase my knight all over the board while getting all of his pieces developed. It would be a nightmare. No pun intended. But if I can get him to maybe drop this pawn down one, get one less attacker on this e5 square, I'd feel a lot more comfortable, or even to trade out this pawn would be a lot better for me. So I decided to play this in order to take care of that e5 threat and maybe throw a wrench in his plans. Instead, we see bishop to e3, and this kind of confused me, because almost every time I play c5 in the King's Indian Defense, I see my opponent drop his d-pawn down to d4, d6. Really, really confusing move, but again, perfect development. He's got the bishops together, the knights are defending the pawns. If you looked at how any person told you to perfectly develop your pieces, this would be it. And this is kind of why you don't do that. So, I took the pawn. And all of a sudden, we see that his position is not so synchronized. He's got an undefended bishop here. He's got some weak pawns over here. He's got this guy right here that's a major troublemaker because he didn't develop his f-pawn first. So this guy is definitely a target for me that I want to attack as soon as possible. Knowing that I want to attack this pawn, I have got to get my bishop onto a better square. I've got to get my queen unblocked. I've got to do a little bit more work, a little bit of preparation to do that. So I played a6. The idea behind this is I need to get this bishop free. If I would have played b5 right now, he could just take it with his bishop. It's a free pawn. I don't want to drop the pawn. I want to prepare before I move. So by playing a6, I can play b5 and then move my bishop out, and everything's going to be good. Instead, he plays a4. And I thought, crap, now, if I play b5 like I like to, he can take, I recapture, he wins the rook. That's no good. Or, if I play b4 and he just takes and I don't recapture, he can win this pawn. No good. He wins a pawn in any exchange. So I've got to prepare for that a little bit better. I played rook b8. Reason for that is I want to get my rook out of the line of fire. I don't want him to be attacking that anymore. I want to play my pawn forward and have this little exchange going on, and then if his bishop takes, I still have some compensation for my pieces. So that was the idea behind that move. Maybe not the best one, but certainly not the worst. He played b4. I think the idea behind this was just to get his pawns pushed out there. I'm not sure that b4 really does much of anything except kind of stops my knight from coming here. But that's what our opponent played, so I continued with my plan by playing b5. I certainly expected this trade to happen because it would win my opponent a pawn in the long run, but it didn't. Instead, our opponent played for this blockade here. So now all of this is kind of seized up, and I'm not going to be attacking on the queen side. Thankfully, I didn't want to anyway. The entire purpose behind playing all this was to attack this pawn and get on the king side. So I went ahead with my plan and played bishop to b7. It puts pressure on this pawn, so now if bishop takes, knight takes, and you've got this kind of bishop, which is your only saving grace from me taking your rook. So I decided to go ahead and play it out. Bishop to a7, perhaps the worst move of the game, in a lot of ways. And this is one of the points I wanted to make with the video. Anytime you're going to attack one of your opponent's pieces, you should certainly look at where that piece can move and look at what your weaknesses are. If you listen to some of these top GMs talk about how to play chess and what some of the things you should be doing are, they call them candidate moves. And the idea behind this is, first of all, in any position, you always want to look if you can check your opponent. There's an old saying that goes, always check, it might be mate, right? So he should have looked first if he could check, put me in check, and he can't right now, and that's fine. The next thing you look at is, what does my opponent threaten, right? So currently, I threaten to take this pawn 2 times. My bishop is kind of threatening to take this knight after I take this pawn, which is nice. I threaten a lot. You should look at all of those and decide what needs defended and what doesn't need defended, and only then you look at how to make your position better. How can you attack your opponent's pieces? How can you make your pieces more valuable? Everything like that. Attacking this rook doesn't do anything for my opponent, because my rook could either move to a8 and immediately threaten his bishop, or the move I played, rook c8, and now threaten the undefended knight. So now your bishop doesn't look so smart on this square, and I've got another attacker here. The problem is we all make mistakes, right, in chess. I know I just kind of ripped on this guy a little bit, but you should be able to know how to play through your mistakes. In this case, I probably just would have put the bishop back where it was. It looks a little bit silly after you do something like that, but at least it brings you back into the position that you kind of need to play this out, because at the current point, this is a little bit unplayable. Instead, my opponent defended with his queen. Admittedly, he has all of his pieces out, he's connected his rooks, and only then has he moved his queen. Again, textbook definition of how you should develop your pieces. However, this bishop is definitely a target. These pawns don't help that bishop to not be a target. He's got some weak pieces, and everything is about to crumble if I start to attack. So I'm going to start to attack. Play bishop takes e4. It's great for me. Bishop takes, and then I could play this knight out, or I could look at this this piece here. Anything like that. It's a temporary sacrifice for a permanent gain. So the bishop recaptures. I take with the knight. Now, if you take with the knight, I win your rook, right? Because this bishop is no longer there to defend it. Not to mention, I've got my knight and my rook looking at your knight, and my bishop even. So this starts to become a major, major problem for white. So he decided to try to delay things a little bit more, and decided to threaten my queen. I don't think that this was necessarily a good move, because anytime you move a piece, you have to understand what you are attacking, what you left undefended, and the square you're moving to, right? The square he just moved to is attacked by a very weak knight. That's a dark square bishop, and I know that mine is going to be really important in checkmating his king, so why not take it off the board while I can? Not to mention, knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes pawn, and I'm an entire exchange ahead. So, I captured there, he recaptured with the pawn, and I kind of realized that my knight is hanging, or, you know, more specifically, I could have taken his queen. So after this move, A takes b6 was not the right idea, because what I should have played here is knight takes queen. I'm a queen up. Maybe you play here, I just go ahead and play here. Everything's good. You don't have your light square bishop to defend anymore. I made a mistake, right? But at least I'm following my ideas. I'm following my pattern and how to kind of play things out a little bit more. So if you do make a mistake like this, try not to harp on it too much. Try to follow some sort of system and a plan to eventually checkmate your opponent. So I took the knight, knowing that if he recaptures here, I win his queen. Didn't really realize that I could have already won his queen, but it puts me another exchange ahead. So my opponent moves his queen finally, and then I realized, oh rats, I could have had it. But all of that's completely fine because there's a pawn hanging, and my pieces are nice and centralized in the board. If you look at his pieces right now, they aren't doing too much of anything. The queen threatens here, but if you take here, I take here. And there's a lot for me to gain. There's not a lot for him to gain. This knight doesn't really do too much of anything. This rook isn't doing anything. Everything is starting to crumble for my opponent. So queen takes here. It defends my pawn here. It allows me to put some more pressure on this side of the board, start to end this blockade that was happening. The rook moves to threaten the bishop. Perfectly fine, but again, we've got to look at where our pieces can go. Currently, my knight's kind of defending this bishop, so I don't really care if the rook takes it there. If it does, then I have a knight here that threatens his queen, plus I'm going to start to move up this side of the board and hopefully promote some pawns. Knowing that my knight was being attacked and that it was just hanging on the square that it was, I decided to put it onto a better square on f6. This way it attacks the queen, I can make the queen move, and I can start to find some more compensation. Better position, sorry, not more compensation. So the queen moved to attack the bishop as well. Again, we've always got to look at what our pieces are doing and what squares they've left undefended, what squares our opponent can go to, what our opponent threatens. So I just took the free pawn, putting me another exchange ahead. My opponent moved the rook over, and here you're going to see me blunder again, which, again, anytime you blunder, you've got to be able to know how to recover from that, and that's one of the other subjects that this video is mainly about. So I played knight to d5, and if you aren't seeing why this is a blunder, the queen can take it absolutely for free, which, of course, my opponent did. Thankfully, this favored me in the position, right? Because my rook is on a half-open file, my queen is x-raying the king through that pawn, my bishop could be better because it's currently being threatened, but it's on a great diagonal as it stands. So I played rook to c5, thinking, hey, take my bishop, I'll win your queen. Again, a little bit of a thought. The queen still has a lot of squares to go to, which, you know, is a problem, but it's fine for now because it develops the rook and it gives me a way to get this bishop into some form of safety. Queen moved to e4. Perfectly fine, planning to attack this pawn, but letting me have complete control over the queen side of the board. So I'm going to start to take advantage of that, pushing this a pawn to defend the bishop, while also showing my opponent that I can push this right up the board. This is what we call a passed pawn in chess. It's going to allow me to eventually get my pawn to the end of the board and make another queen. So I started to think, well, if I can get my rook up here, if I can get my queen to defend this square, and my bishop to attack this square as well, then there's nothing my opponent can do. I don't really care if he wins this pawn, because then I'll win this pawn, and that's exactly what happened in the game. My opponent took on e7, and I took on c2. And now we start to see the plan unravel. His queen on a horrendous square. There's nothing he can do to really get any compensation for putting his queen here. Currently, it looks a little bit silly. He can't take here because of my pawn. My rook is on the second rank. It's all starting to unravel. He played the knight out to attack the rook. Thankfully, that knight is also being attacked, and there's nothing he can do about it. So I just took it. And now my queen is exactly where I wanted it. I get to attack the square that my a-pawn is going to land, and everything's just fine. Rook here. Perfectly fine move. He starts to realize that the first rank is becoming a major problem for him, and that he needs to get some pieces back there to defend his king. If not, it's going to be checkmate. So I started pushing the A-pawn. My pieces are where I want them. Everything's lined up. It's all going to be great. Here, I missed mate in 2. I know this might seem like a really solid move, because if I move the queen, you're going to win this pawn. And if his king weren't where it was, that would be very true. It would be a really solid move. However, queen takes here, check. King can either move here or here, and then queen takes, checkmate. I missed it. But I did still have a really, really solid plan. Instead, I decided to move my rook here, because the rook can't take here, because it would be captured by the queen. And even then, it's not like you're going to win this rook, because my queen defends the rook. If you capture here, I take your rook. I'm sorry, I take your rook here, and then yeah, sure, you win a pawn, but I'm going to have a lot of compensation after something like bishop here. So that was the general idea, and if he did nothing about this, then rook takes here, rook takes here, rook takes here, or I'm sorry, queen takes here, check. So instead, he moved the rook, and this is where I saw the checkmating pattern. And if you weren't quite following along when I explained it earlier, it goes like this. Queen takes f2, check, king h1, queen takes g2, mate. And if you're wondering how this could have deferred, or how this could have been different, the king could have come to h2, but however, check on g2 is still mate. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and maybe you learned about the King's Indian defense a little bit. Maybe you learned about some ideas on how to recover from mistakes, because it happens to all of us. Even grandmasters make mistakes. So hopefully you learned how to kind of recover from those, and how to form a plan and then execute it. And I'm going to be doing a lot more videos like this, so be sure to let me know if you guys did enjoy. My name's Timalik, and I'll see you all next time. See you guys.